The Secretary in DIPP made was India needs a huge sea change. In terms of a mindset, how the state deals with its citizens. And this mindset impacts not merely on processes, it also impacts through formulation of policy. I've always wondered if we didn't have a government, what would happen? It'll always remain a vexed question whether we'll become anarchic or utopian. Because governments are necessary to enforce the rule of law, to make orderly conduct of life in a country. So that the country doesn't turn anarchic. But at times, too much governance can also add misery to life. And therefore, governments, while formulating policy and deciding their overall approach, will always have to decide where the balance lies. I firmly hold a view that when in power, there is always a desire to regulate. India has changed, and I must say, in all fairness, even civil service is changing. Governments are also changing, but policy makers in India, and I'm here referring to the political policy makers, the mindset is still regulatory. So if you actually see the debates in Parliament, the ministers may, as a part of a general reform process, try and ease in systems in terms of policy and processes. But 9 out of 10 speeches always advocate greater regulatory measures. So the control temperament or the control freak temperament of the political system has still not been fully done away with. And there is a legacy. I remember, of course, the resources were also inadequate at that time. So you can't only blame the governments, but you certainly have to blame them because they pursued a policy to make resources inadequate. If I look back and on 2 yardsticks, when I said the basic question is whether without governments we'd be anarchic or we'd be utopian, the principal purpose of a government and policy is merely to improve the quality of life of people and provide them an ease of life. You can't have a population living in stress and distress. You can't have an over-regulated society. You can't have a government which many people relish, which is the original form of what is the My Baap government. So you look at the state for every benefit. Both the economic and the political model that the Marxists had advocated globally over the last 3 decades has been smashed. And therefore you have different models which have taken over world over. I recollect as a child when I was growing up, And I remember India in the decades of the 60s, a little before or after that, what was the kind of life that we were providing to our citizens. And this is giving a reasonable rebate for the fact that the national resources were inadequate. We were all training our society and our people to live in an economy of shortages. So the number of houses was short. And if the number of houses was short, you had to have rent control. And if you had to have rent control, why should I build houses when I can get a cheaper place on rent and I can never be ejected? So the whole housing and real estate and hence quality of life suffered. We thought it was evil to allow private institutions to open colleges. So state with its inadequate resources would open schools and colleges. Some other missionaries or other caste or religious groups, the DAV and others would Khalsa institutions would open colleges or schools. So keep inadequate number of institutions. I remember when I first became an MP, the first very day when our identity card used to be given to us, and that was not decades ago, it was about 16 years ago, the first thing which was handed over to us was, along with our identity cards, a large bunch of booklets by which we had a discretion to give gas connections to people. Then we were also given a record that out-of-turn telephone connections could be given by us. The only facility which now remains is that we are allowed some out-of-turn Kendriya Vidyalaya admissions. And suddenly when the system was changing, the then Prime Minister, Mr. Vajpayee, with his sense of humor, he said when he became a Prime Minister member, and he said this continued till the 70s, I was not aware of it, each member of parliament also had an authority to sanction out-of-turn scooters and 2 HMT watches every year. So the so-called policies of the 50s which we hail was attuned to get people to adjust to shortages. So the amount of sugar you consume had to be regulated, the amount of wheat everybody got had to be regulated, the amount of kerosene people got had to be regulated, school fees had to be regulated. And we lived by regulation, and therefore with over-regulation there was no initiative for any form of growth. And I think these forms that you are talking about were a necessary byproduct of that process. Many countries in the world slowly started changing. I am one of those who believe that what started in 1991 should have actually started in 1971. And that is why probably the 70s and 80s would always go down as the wasted decades of Indian growth stories. And what did some of those regulations achieve? There's a current member in the Niti Aayog, Vivek Debroy, who wrote a very nice book on obsolete laws. And if you read some of those chapters of the book, till about 15 years ago, we had laws continuing. One of the laws is called the Sarai Act. So the Sarai Act related to a period where there was no transport system and people travelled on horses and camels. And if they had to come from, let us say, Peshawar and go to Bombay, then they'll spend months doing it. So they travel during the day and sleep somewhere at night in a sarai. So it was mandatory for every sarai to offer them a right to drink water and offer them a toilet. So we said all hotels in India will require a registration under the Sarais Act. So till the 90s, every hotel in India had the same obligation continuing. And the hotel which was most visited, because people used to go and see the gateway of India at Mumbai, so they would then determine that they had a right to enter the Taj Mahal Hotel and enforce their rights under the Sarai Act, till the hotel became unworkable. So the Taj Mahal Hotel management decided to create a toilet block next to the sea. There is still one. And then the other department of the government said, no, you can't do it because it violates the CRZ zone. So this is how we regulated the whole system. And I think a lot of changes started, particularly in the last 24, 25 years. And we must remember, and particularly those of you who are entering the service now, that reforms is a process or a system where there is no finishing line. It's a race which is never going to end. The needs of the system and society are going to discover something which has to change almost by the day. So what did the government in 91 do? The first thing they did was to dismantle the licensing requirements of law. Now, the licensing requirements of law came from the fact that even though industries is a state subject, there is a category of industries which used to be covered under the IDRA Act, which was so declared, where you required a central permission. So Amitabh's department was the most powerful department in the country till 1991, where people had to line up either to ask for a license to do business in India, or line up to make sure that the competitor doesn't get it. You know what was the result of this? The kind of suffering that act and this department had caused. You had a choice of 2 or 3 cars with obsolete technology and a 10-year waiting list. You had a choice of 2 two-wheeler scooters with a 20-year waiting list. Your telecommunications, if you applied for a phone, there used to be a list. Until the 1990s, the list used to be, we have cleared the waiting list as till 1962. So 20 years, 30 years to get a telephone. And I think dismantling the role of the state made us better off. It gave plurality of choice. It encouraged competition. It encouraged quality. It encouraged people to invest. And when the telecom services were opened up in 94, 95, the regulatory mindset, if you read the parliament debates of that time, China will listen to our conversations. So these were the kind of arguments which were used. And the best, easiest way to stop a reform is to say, well, national security doesn't permit it. But the result of the whole process was that post-91 India has gradually transformed from shortages to surpluses. Today we have an entirely different problem. So in terms of many commodities, the nature of our problems and challenges have changed. So we have surplus sugar, we have surplus wheat, we have surplus rice, we have surplus cotton, we have surplus in steel. So we have even surplus in power now. And we are still struggling because our secretaries here as deputy secretaries were trained how to manage shortages, and now as secretaries they have to be trained how to manage surpluses. And therefore prices of commodities are collapsing. And an alternative model will have to be found out. I think therefore when you speak in terms of citizen-centric governance, the first underlying rule is that every action must be aimed in providing a better quality of life and ease to the citizen. Wherever possible, the role of state should be minimized. And therefore, unless we are able to generate a whole system where from services to products, it must be intended to generate a surplus in the society. You have surplus in engineering seats, but you have inadequacy of medical seats. And therefore, if you are able to generate a surplus, your entire problems of high fees, high capitation fees, no rural doctors available in the rural areas, bulk of your problems automatically resolve themselves. So whether it is the social infrastructure or it's the physical infrastructure, the policy will have to be always so designed. Governmental monopolies must end. Now wherever we ended them, we are better off. We ended them in the airline sector, we haven't ended them in the railway sector. And the result is very clear. The size of our railways, because the British didn't build highways, they built the railways. So we've added about 10 to 15% in the last 68 years. But in sectors which we had to start and where we brought in other segments of society, we brought in a lot of people and we brought in a lot of investment. There are many ways of doing this. Now, as far as your processes are concerned, you'll have to, for every department, they'll have to undertake a simplification exercise. And particularly those departments which have the interface of the public with them. And who has the interface of public? From the local municipalities and panchayats to the taxation authorities, to educational departments. Dr. Jitendra Singh was speaking in terms of transfers. I can tell you, I have a large number of elected representatives who visit me every day. And I anxiously await them to come and tell me about policy changes required in the governance. But all I get every day is dozens of applications for transfers of bank officials or tax inspectors, as though the job of the North Block is only confined to that. I think this whole mindset in terms of elected governance, and when we go around the country and visit, it's only these kind of applications that you will receive. And therefore, this really will have to change. But I'll give you some specific illustrations. You have millions of people across the country getting state support subsidies. One of our former prime ministers, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, had said only 15% subsidy reaches the poor. Now this entire system of what we have started referring to as the JAM Trinity, the Janadhan, the mobile and the Aadhaar platform, the impact of this can be a person gets a scholarship from the center and the state. He is entitled to only one. Individual have multiple LPG gas connections in their name, and each one is subsidized. Tomorrow it may be food. Day after it could be some other segment. Now putting LPG on jam itself has almost saved 30% subsidy. It's eliminated multiple connections. Now we've decided all the Manrega payments, the center pays the state sends it to the districts give it to the panchayats, and maybe a minuscule fraction reaches the beneficiary. Now the bank accounts of all the Manrega workers will directly get money from the center. So it has to be an automatic transfer. He doesn't have to go anywhere, he doesn't have to fill a form, he doesn't have to go to the panchayat head, he doesn't have to go to the collectorate. Whether it's the old age pensions or the widow pensions, the state governments give it. Scholarship to children and minority children, there are huge programs of the government. Lakhs of children get it every year. Now you have the technology in place, you have the systems in place. And therefore this whole idea of simplifying form has now to be thought one step ahead, that forms must go. Because technology itself is going to make these forms redundant. I'll give you a simpler example. A department which has a very bad reputation conventionally, and maybe for good reason, has been the income tax department. Now there are systems which have started on the strength of technology. People are being persuaded, file your returns only in the electronic mode. So returns are being filed. So you don't have to go anywhere, you just file it sitting at home. What are the changes required in the system? First, you file your returns in the electronic mode. The assessments are made, and for the current year, the returns have been filed. The date was extended from 31st August to 7th September. And while I speak to you on 12th September, 5 days thereafter, the CBDT has informed me that it's so easy that in about 26,000 odd cases, the exact number I'm missing out on, the tax refunds have already been dispatched. Last year, out of the 3.5 crore odd returns filed, 1 crore 35 lakh odd people got refunds. So now you don't need people to go to your houses and give you refunds and ask for a kickback. So smaller amounts were transferred directly to the bank accounts. The bigger amounts, you were electronically informed, and within 24 hours, the speed post goes with a check. So 1 crore 35 lakh people received their refunds. A system which has been reasonably notorious in the past. But then it will take time for both the public servants and elected representatives to adjust. This year on the 28th of February, when I was reading the budget, only once during the entire reading was I heckled. And that is where the entire regulatory mindset comes in. When you speak in terms of ease of doing business, you have to provide to your investor a regime which is better than the regime that your neighbor has. Otherwise, he says, well, such and such country gives me these facilities. How do I come to you when I get a better tax rate? You charge me 15% more tax than another country does, so I'd rather invest there. So you have to make your taxes and your systems globally compatible. Our rate of corporate tax is 30%. We charge surcharges, it comes to about 34% plus. But then we as governments have retained the power of discretion. And that discretion is, to some segments I will start giving exemptions. So it's a great pleasure when people come to you with a begging bowl and ask for exemptions. There may be exemptions for individuals, societies. I'm not talking of the exemptions which are incentives for savings, which an individual assessee gets. So as a result of all the corporate exemptions, and I'm only referring to corporate, the actual realization with the government is 22%. So we have a bad image of a 34% plus tax charging country, but our receipt is 24%, 22%. There is, because of these exemptions, bulk of the tax litigation is around these exemptions. So I took a decision that I would bring down the corporate tax down over the next 4 years to 25%, and I will phase out all the exemptions, or most of them. So in the end, I would probably end up getting a higher amount of tax, but then a corporate taxation return also would be minimal because there are no exemptions to be claimed. This is my income, this is the tax paid, that's the end of the matter. And optically the taxation would be globally compatible because 22-25% is a globally compatible rate. This was the only question on which I had to pause for a little while till the house became peaceful. But then this is the kind of reform we'll require. Nobody had the courage to say, every man possessing some property in India or some jewelry beyond a certain limit had to file a wealth tax return. So we run a huge department. The highest tax we have got is about 900 crores in the whole year from the whole country. And it generated a huge amount of corruption. So last year I said wealth tax is abolished, the super rich will have to pay some 2% surcharge extra. So millions of returns have disappeared with effect from this year. Now this is a kind of a processes that we require. And why can't we not carry them on to other areas? Now, whole den of corruption is municipalities. And municipalities is the face of government. It's impossible in a usual manner to get a permission, in a simplified manner to construct a house or a building.